Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know, today we're going to be tackling something that's pretty important if you're trying to make sense of global politics, and especially if you're a UPSC aspirant getting ready for that international relations paper. We're talking about identity politics, and we're going to be diving into an excerpt that's probably already on your reading list. So whether you're aiming for top marks or just want to kind of stay informed, this deep dive should be pretty helpful.
It's really interesting to see how much the political landscape has changed. Like back in the 20th century, it was all about those big ideological showdowns, like communism versus capitalism. It was a battle over economic systems, really.
Right. So it's like who owns what? And now it's kind of shifted to more of a who are we sort of question.
Yeah.
It's less about those systems and more about things like culture and ethnicity and religion,
Mm,
all those different things that make up individual and group identities. It almost feels like a more personal kind of battlefield now.
absolutely. And I think one of the big things that's driven this shift is this idea that those grand universalist ideologies, the ones that promised equality for everyone, they kind of fell short for a lot of people.
So instead of feeling empowered by these ideals, a lot of groups felt kind of left out or even marginalized.
Right.
It's like the system was supposed to speak for everyone, but their voices weren't really being heard.
Exactly. And that's where identity politics comes in. It's about reclaiming that power, demanding recognition for identities that have been overlooked or suppressed. It's about saying, hey, we're here, we're unique, and our experiences matter.
Like the Black consciousness movement, for example. It wasn't just about achieving equality within the existing system. It was about celebrating Blackness, challenging that pressure to kind of conform to a dominant culture.
Right. And, these identity-based movements, they have a big impact on international relations, something you'll definitely see in your UPSC studies. When groups start asserting their identities on a global stage, it can shake things up, challenge those old power structures, and sometimes it can even lead to conflict.
Okay, so we've established that identity politics is a major force today. But what sparked this whole shift, it didn't just come out of nowhere, did it?
Definitely not. There are some deep-rooted historical factors at play here. Like, think about the wave of postcolonialism that swept the globe. As former colonies gained their independence, they weren't just throwing off political control, they were also trying to figure out their own WN cultural identities, often rejecting those Western influences.
Right. It's like saying we're not just going to copy your systems, we're going to forge our own path based on our own values and traditions. A rejection of that one-size-fits-all approach.
Precisely. And along with postcolonialism, there was another factor that contributed to the rise of identity politics: disillusionment with socialist models, especially in the developing world. When these systems failed to deliver on their promises of economic and social progress, people started looking for different paths that were often rooted in their own cultural identities.
So when that grand narrative of socialism kind of crumbled, people turned inwards to their own cultural frameworks, their own communities. It's almost like a return to those roots, a
Yeah.
search for something familiar and authentic in a world that's changing so rapidly.
And of course, we can't forget about globalization. It's created this paradox where the world's becoming more interconnected, but that interconnectedness can also make people anxious about losing their uniqueness.
Yeah, it's like the world is getting smaller, but that shrinking can feel threatening if it means giving up your cultural identity or your sense of belonging. It's almost a defensive reaction, to protect what's precious.
Exactly. Asserting your identity becomes a way to push back against that threat. It's about holding on to your distinctiveness in a world that feels increasingly homogenous.
So we've got postcolonialism, disillusionment with socialism, and the anxieties of globalization all feeding into the rise of identity politics. It's a potent mix, and it's had some pretty traumatic consequences.
And maybe the most stark example of that is the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's a tragic illustration of how identity politics, when it's manipulated and exploited, can lead to really devastating conflicts.
Yeah, it's a case study that's particularly relevant for those UPSC aspirants out there
Mhm.
because it really highlights how those seemingly abstract concepts like identity can actually become the fault lines for real-world conflict with consequences that ripple through the whole international system.
The Yugoslav case was all about the fragmentation of a nation along those ethnic and national lines. Those deep-seated feelings of belonging, of shared history and culture, they became flashpoints for violence, ultimately leading to those horrific Balkan Wars. And you know what makes the Yugoslav example even more complicated is it really shows this tension within identity politics itself. It's not just about saying no to the dominant story. It's also about figuring out, well, what's our you are story then? And that can get messy, when you have all these different groups, each with their own identity, fighting for power and recognition within the same space.
So it becomes a question of like, okay, we're not going to accept your definition of who we are, but then whose definition do we accept? It's easy to see how that kind of struggle within identity politics can lead to even more divisions and conflicts.
Absolutely. And this kind of brings us to another interesting aspect of identity politics, its relationship with individualism.
Wait, I'm a little confused here. How does individualism fit into the idea of group identities? Aren't those two kind of opposites?
It might seem that way at first, but they're actually pretty intertwined. Identity politics kind of blends those traditional ideas of belonging with this very modern emphasis on individual self-expression.
So it's not just about inheriting an identity, it's about actively creating it for yourself.
Exactly. And globalization, which we often see as a threat to identity, actually plays a role in this too. Think about it. Globalization exposes people to a much wider range of cultures, values, ideas. It gives them more options to choose from when they're constructing their own sense of self.
So instead of being limited to these predetermined identities, people can kind of mix and match elements from different cultures, creating these hybrid identities that are unique to them.
Exactly. Identity becomes much more fluid and dynamic in a globalized world. It's not just about where you're from or the group you belong to. It's about how you choose to define yourself within those contexts.
And that adds like a whole other layer of complexity for anyone trying to analyze international relations,
Yeah.
especially for those prepping for the UPSC. We can't just look at history or economics anymore. We also have to understand how people and groups are shaping and reshaping their identities in this interconnected world.
Right, because those individual and collective identities have a huge impact on everything. From diplomacy and conflict resolution to economic policy and cultural exchange, you can't really understand global politics without understanding the dynamics of identity politics.
So bringing it back to the text we're looking at today, the authors talk about the perceived failure of liberal universalism as a key driver of identity politics. What exactly do they mean by that?
Well, they're basically arguing that one of the reasons identity politics has become so popular is that those traditional liberal values, which are often seen as Western, have failed to deliver on their promises of equality and inclusion for everyone.
So it's not just a critique of certain policies, it's a critique of the whole liberal framework.
Right. There's this feeling that these universalist ideologies, while claiming to be neutral, actually end up favoring certain groups and marginalizing others. And that sense of marginalization is what fuels the need for identity politics as a counterforce.
It's about taking back control, demanding recognition for those identities that have been ignored or pushed aside by the dominant narrative.
Exactly. It's about saying our experiences and perspectives matter, and we're not going to be silenced anymore.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The shift from ideology to identity, the history behind it, the tension between individual and group identities, and that critique of liberal universalism. But let's be real, there's a question that's probably on everyone's mind. Can identity politics be dangerous?
That's the big question, isn't it? And like most things in international relations, the answer isn't so simple. Identity politics can be a really powerful force for positive change, for empowerment, for social justice. But it can also be manipulated and exploited in ways that lead to division and conflict.
Like we saw in Yugoslavia, those ethnic and national identities became weapons, fueling violence and destruction on a massive scale.
Exactly. And even when it doesn't lead to actual violence, focusing too much on identity can create this us versus them mentality, which makes it really hard to build bridges and find common ground between different groups.
Kind of like a double-edged sword, right? It can bring people together around shared experiences and values, but it can also push them apart and create these barriers to understanding and empathy, almost like a powerful current. It can either lift you up or drag you under.
And that's why it's so important to think critically about all this. Don't just settle for easy answers or get swept up in the rhetoric. You have to really dig deeper, question those assumptions, and look at the nuances, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant. You need that nuanced understanding of global politics.
Right. It's not about judging or picking sides. It's about recognizing that identity politics is complex, understanding how it shapes the world around us for better or worse.
Exactly. And that means asking those tough questions, like what are the good things and the bad things about identity politics? How can it be a force for unity A&D division? What are the ethics of using identity as a political tool? These are the questions you need to wrestle with, not just for the UPSC exam, but for navigating a world where identity plays such a big role.
And those are not easy questions to answer. But if we want to move beyond those simplistic narratives and really understand this phenomenon, those are the questions we need to be asking.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It makes us think deeply about human nature, about power and belonging. and what it means to be human in a world that's becoming more connected but also more divided along these identity lines.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought we'll leave you with. Can identity politics be a force for both unity and division on the global stage? Can we use its power for good while also limiting its potential for harm?
It's a question that'll keep being debated for years to come. But engaging in that debate, grappling with those complexities, that's how we move forward.
And for those of you on that UPSC journey, this is just the beginning of your exploration. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those complexities of global politics. And hey, if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more insights into these critical topics. Until next time.